But I'll tell you that the crisis that we're in right now has cost us, you and me as taxpayers, less than the crisis we had in the 1980s. So this has been a pretty nice recession so far. In the 1980s, we had 19, well, let me tell you, today in this crisis, we've had 19 bank failures. And the FDIC would say there's 107 banks they're worried about. So 19 have failed across the nation, 107 are on the watch list. In the 1980s, we had 1,000 banks fail, and another 1,000 were on the watch list. So clearly it was a much deeper, much more serious recession back in the 80s than what we've experienced so far. If you haven't thought about it, it's a really bad day when you go to your bank and find out it's failed. It's not one that plays well for your family. Even in 1980, between 85 and 90, when we had all these failures, the cost to the taxpayer was still less than the cost of the Great Depression back in the 30s. Now, I would tell you that Chairman Bernanke, I think, may be the foremost authority in the country on the Depression. He has studied it. He wrote his graduate thesis on it. He has spent most of his life studying the Depression. And he's kind of at the controls along with the Treasury Secretary. And one of the reasons you see so much money being put into this economy is they're convinced that that's what caused the Depression, was the lack of liquidity. So when these markets freeze up and you can't get capital, you find these guys in the background continuing to find ways to put money into the economy. And that's what keeps the wheels of commerce moving, keeps people employed, keeps the consumer spending, and lets the economy continue to roll along. So we have lost, in terms of cost to us, less than the 80s, and the 80s cost the taxpayer less than it did in the Great Depression. Now, kind of a fun statistic, I'm just going to throw this in, it takes me off track a little bit, but through this expansion period that we've had since, probably the last 40 years, economists would say that it has been tilted toward the wealthy, that the wealthy have been the ones that have gotten more wealthy, and the poor middle class hasn't shared in this time of prosperity. They've been kind of beaten down. And if you look at coal statistics, that's true. But we actually dug behind them at the Minneapolis Fed and said, you know, we're always talking about there's 18% more income for the middle class and much, much more for the wealthy. Why did the middle class not participate in this great time of productivity? And what we found was that in 1976, when they did the census, they would go to a home and there was a working spouse and another working spouse, and they added those two incomes together, and that's how much they made. When they go to a household today, there's a couple of people living in there, but they're not married. So they can't add their income together, so you have separate income being reported. Or if they are married, spouse lives in this house and the other spouse lives in another house. The family structure has changed from what it was in 1976. So we went back and said, okay, let's just pretend that the people that are living together are actually married. And let's add their incomes together because they're behaving like a family unit. Then what happened to the middle class? And I would tell you that instead of having their income grow 18%, it comes out to somewhere between 44 and 62%, which is exactly where the upper class or the wealthy people are. So we say, okay, so the middle class has participated in this expansion. So the economic policies that the country has have been good policies. It's just that families are different today. They're less traditional than they were back in the 70s. It's something as simple as that. So when you read about the statistical evidence regarding who participated, kind of look behind the numbers, if you will. All right, when you have a liquidity crisis, you know what you have is a crisis of confidence. And what that means is those people that have money, because money's still out there. It didn't go away. It's still sitting there. It doesn't have the confidence to lend it to the people that need money. So let's think for a minute about TARP, T-A-R-P, which is a Troubled Asset Recovery Program. And that's what the Treasury Secretary said when he brought the 9 biggest banks in the world into a room and said, you're not going home until you sign this form that you're going to accept $125 billion of capital from the government, and it's going to be a preferred shareholder of your bank. Because these banks said, you know, we don't need the money, don't want the money. We got plenty of capital. And then the government said we're going to save the other $125 billion for the rest of those banks, like First Interstate, because they're not sitting at the table. But the government wants to make an investment in all of the banks. Why do you think they would want to do that? Well, the reason is that in order to, when they did the stimulus package, when the government last February approved that stimulus package, they put about $107 billion out to get it into the economy. You got a rebate check if you had been working. You got $300 or $600. Well, if they put capital in a bank, the bank has to do something with that capital, or they just cost their shareholders money. So the bank's got to leverage that capital, meaning they got to lend it out. And just to break even on that capital, just so you didn't hurt your shareholders, you got to lend out 5 times more than what they gave you. And most banks will leverage their capital 10 times. So suddenly, I think the Treasury Secretary was brilliant, because he said, I'm going to put $250 billion in the banks, and immediately it's going to be worth 10 times that in cash that's flowing through the system. And it's an investment. It's not a giveaway, a give back like the stimulus package was. So you may think it's only going to the banks, but the banks have to lend that money back to you, otherwise their shareholders lose. And that's the whole basis of this TARP program. And I think it was very clever, because he's using that leverage principle to get more money out and keep this economy liquefied and to keep it moving. Well, let me leave you with one thought, and then we're going to open up for questions, because I hope you can see where we've been. I would tell you that I would never bet against the U.S. economy. I think this is exactly the place to be investing, and we're at a time in the market that you're going to look back on and say, gee, if I'd had a whole bunch of money, I would have made investments back in '08, because there are great bargains out there to be had. But as you become a borrower in your personal life or in your business, there's an old adage that says, borrow money from a pessimist, because they don't expect to get paid back anyway. And if you come to First Interstate, we're very optimistic. Now, if I may, let me open the floor to see what's on your mind, and we'll talk to you. Yes, sir. Yes.
When you just mentioned the TARP program, it sounds like it's lots of cash going to the banks that need to be lent out. How do you prevent subprime lending again, because the banks want to lend that cash to make money to the system?
What a great question. I have to restate your question, because this is being recorded and it won't pick you up in the audience. But the question was, if there was too much cash flowing in the first place that caused problems, now getting more cash into the system, won't it just cause a repeat of those problems? Is that a fair restatement? Well, what's happened is the cash that was flowing before isn't flowing today, because banks that have money don't trust the other banks that need money. We're all saying, you've got bad assets on your balance sheet, so I'm not going to lend you my money. So the banks that are able to make loans don't have the money to make the loans. The banks that have the money don't have the demand. People don't need to borrow from them. You know, you don't get a lot of loans made in China and Japan and places like that. So it's a leveling factor, trying to build confidence back in the system so banks will again begin to lend to each other, and people in business can go to the capital markets and get capital to expand their businesses. Right now, nobody trusts anybody, so things are just seized up.